All right, so our first speaker this afternoon is Matt Baskerville. He's a certified funeral service practitioner and certified pre-planning consultant. He's a funeral director, embalmer, and crematory operator who's been serving Grundy, Will, and the surrounding counties for more than 30 years. He owns and operates 5 legacy funeral homes in the area with a history of more than a century of service. Under Matt's direction, his funeral homes have not only received the Illinois Award of Funeral Service Distinction, but in 2024 were named Best of the Best by the National Funeral Directors Association internationally. So we welcome Matt Baskerville. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, a little more about me. I hate that bio, but I've been working in funeral service for, it'll be 33 years. I went right out of high school into mortuary school and have been serving families literally since I've been 18 years old. And I never knew that I would have the opportunity to come back and work in my hometown communities, but I was given that honor, and I certainly am just thrilled to be able to serve the families that so many, and there are a few here that probably knew me before I knew them. So, but there's something very special about being of service to individuals who you've known your whole life. So, I think I just want to start out by saying that for literally thousands of years, funerals have been a means of expressing our beliefs, our thoughts, and our feelings about the death of someone that we love. And I'm here to just give a little brief overview of pre-planning. Pre-planning your funeral is a powerful way to ensure that your faith and values are respected when the time comes. In most all milestone events in life, whether it be baptism, birthdays, graduations, weddings, typically there's planning involved. More often than not, when a funeral is being planned, oftentimes it's not pre-planned or planned at all until the need arises. It's a difficult conversation to have, but I think it's fair to say that most of you here in this room are open to hear about it, or you wouldn't be here today. So, pre-planning can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I like to always start out when I have these presentations and share this story about a family that I served. It's been a number of years ago that their father had passed away. And the family had come in and said said he had taken care of everything, and just to give you a call. So I go and look in our paper files and I can find nothing electronic filed, and I'm like, I don't have anything. And they're like, we don't understand. Dad said everything was taken care of. And so then I get that, anxiety of like, are they at the wrong funeral home? Are they, what is this all about? So they were not too happy with me to have to proceed from scratch, making funeral arrangements. But we proceeded on, everything was arranged, and 2 days later they bring in his clothing. And his clothing, he was well prepared. It was a suit bag that said, "For my funeral," and they give it to me, and I'm proceeding and dressing this individual. And as I'm getting him ready, I feel a lump in the pocket of his suit coat. And lo and behold, what's in that pocket but an envelope full of cash? Oh. And I called the family and I said, I think I understand now what your dad meant when he said everything was taken care of. It was pretty accurate too, how much that funeral was based on the cash. But in his mind, he felt as though it was taken care of. His suit was in the bag, it was labeled, and the funeral was paid for. But he never followed through with the fact of getting all of that information in file and actually planning the service. So that's why I say pre-planning means something different to everybody. But it gives you an opportunity to finalize some of the many details that when you're overcome with grief, it's hard to focus upon. You know, whether that be down to the specifics of the liturgy, you know, selecting the particulars of the Mass of Christian burial or the music, or even the flowers that you want on display for your service. But once you do the pre-planning and compiling all of that information, you also have the option of prepaying. And that's probably one of the biggest questions that we get is, can we prepay the funeral? And yes, you can prepay. And I always tell families that the most important thing is the information. Having that information down and on paper. And not only having it down and on paper, but in a place that someone knows where it's at. If it's not on file with the funeral home, it doesn't do any good if it's in your safety deposit box. And nobody can get in that safety deposit box until a month after you're buried. So it's important to have that information in a place that someone knows where it's at. But when you prepay a funeral, you're not paying the funeral home directly. The funeral home legally cannot hold those funds. They have to put it into a third-party vehicle. And the reason for that is that for whatever reason, if you decide to move away, you know, maybe you move to another part of the country, or you move in with kids in a different geographic location, and the death occurs elsewhere, it's always transferable. The funeral home goes out of business, it's transferable. You get mad at the funeral director, hope not with me, but it's transferable. The purpose of having it in a third-party funding vehicle is that it's always your money and you can take it wherever. Most funeral homes will guarantee, you can do guaranteed funeral arrangements, you can do non-guaranteed funeral arrangements. For example, we guarantee our services. You know, you come in and pre-plan, you prepay. We guarantee that if you pay it in full today, we're going to guarantee that the services and the merchandise that you select that we have on your contract, we're going to guarantee for the money that is in that insurance policy. We use insurance at time of death. We'll pay for what you have selected. Most funding vehicles, funeral homes can use insurance policies, they can use trusts, and they can also use annuities. And each funeral home kind of has their own rationale and reasoning of why they choose those vehicles. But pre-planning, prepaying, I don't know of another business that you can walk into and say, I want to pay this amount for this TV today, and guarantee that it's going to cost that 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. I think it's also important too that pre-planning isn't always necessarily for the elderly and the infirmed. So often we get individuals who pre-plan because they're going into hospice care. And it's an end-of-life decision to get things in order. Some of you here may know my mother, Violet. My mother, Violet, has kind of been the face of our pre-planning program for really about the last 20 years. She's kind of going into retirement mode, and Jill here is kind of transitioning into that role. But my mom understands pre-planning because when she was 33 years old, my father was killed in a car accident. I was 8 years old, my brother was 14 years old, and she was left to make funeral arrangements for her husband. She and my father never even thought about the concept of having that conversation of, what do you want to do? Where do you want to be buried? That was a time when it was more of a traditional society. Cremation wasn't quite as prevalent as it is today, but they never thought about it. And the plans that were made were fine. Buried next to my grandfather, you know, the same family plot that I'll be buried in. My name's on the stone currently as well. But she can tell you to this day that she doesn't remember one aspect of making those funeral arrangements. You're just blindsided by it. And she was just on autopilot. Thankfully, she had other people around her to help guide her. But if she could have done it over again, I'm sure that there probably would have been a lot of things that would have been different. So I think it's important to know that, you know, you should be thinking about pre-planning it at every age, young and old. So to give you a little further insight on how the pre-planning process works, when I sit down with a family, one of the things that I first like to do is kind of establish some information. And I typically will go through vital statistics, biographical information, survivors. What information you put in a pre-planning file, it's just a framework. All of that's going to change. Families are going to grow. Kids are going to move away. Your hobbies are going to evolve. But it's good to have a framework put in place. Once the information is gathered, that's when we start talking about services and arrangements. And I can't express how important it is to have the conversation with your family of not only what you think you want, but what they need. So often I will get families that will come in to do pre-arrangements and they'll say, Matt, I don't want anything. I just want to be cremated, no services, nothing. And I'll say, well, have you talked to the kids about that? Oh no, we're not going to bother them with that. We're not, we don't want to put them through that. On more times than I can count, I've sent families away. And I've said, you go have a conversation with your kids. See if that's really what they want, if that's what they think that they need, and then you come back to me. More often than not, those individuals will come back to me and say, you know what, we talked to our daughter, we talked to our son, whatever, talked to our family members. They think they're gonna need to see me before I'm cremated. Great. You know, when it's on a file and you have nothing, and then the death occurs, sometimes that pre-planning can also put your family member in that compromising position of like, I really wanted something different, but we don't want to go against mom or dad's wishes too. So I can't express more. We participate in a program that's a national program called Have the Talk of a Lifetime. It's a great program. I should have copied that. I never thought of bringing that. But Have the Talk of a Lifetime is basically a program that's just telling you to have that conversation with your families of what you wish. So once we talk about services, then we get into pricing. I hate to tell you all, but funerals are expensive. There's a cost to it. Just like anything else in life, there's expenses that are incurred with funeral expenses. And so often I will get the question asked of, how much is a funeral? Wow, that's a tough question. That's like saying how much is a car? I mean, you can buy a very economic car, you can buy an extravagant sports car. There's kind of everything in between. I think there's an option for everyone at an affordable rate that anyone can afford. But I think it's also important for you to know that funeral homes are overseen by the Federal Trade Commission. And when you walk into a funeral home and start talking about services and merchandise, by law, the funeral home should be presenting you with a general price list. What's a general price list? This is our general price list. I put our general price list on our website. You can go to our website on your phone and pull up our general price list. The general price list is a mandated document that itemizes every service that the funeral home offers. There is a non-declinable charge that the funeral can have for your services, but you should be able to, families can come in and pick and choose what they want and not get stuck by paying one price. And how this evolved is years ago, when you would purchase a funeral, it would be this casket and our services is, $5,000. Well, you really don't know how much the casket is, and you don't know how much all of the services are because you're just buying a casket that's including services. The Federal Trade Commission came in and said consumers need to be able to to understand and pay for only the services they wish to choose. Now that doesn't say that funeral homes don't have packages. We have packages because it is easier for families to have a traditional funeral service package. What's a traditional funeral service package? Matt, we want to have a funeral at Immaculate Conception Parish. We want a visitation the night before. We want the funeral at Mass. We're going to get buried out at Mount Carmel. Well, I can tell you that there's the transfer from place of death. There's going to be embalming if we're going to have visitation. There's going to be preparation. We're going to be using our facilities for visitation the evening before. We're going to be putting that casket in the back of our funeral coach to drive it to church and drive it to the cemetery. There's going to be a graveside services. You know, we package up a traditional funeral service. When you package it, you have to discount it. You have to take all of those individual charges, and then there has to be a discount to it to make it a package. So you can do a package, but you should be getting a general price list so that you can understand the pricing. Our price list, for example, I include our caskets in it, I include urns, I include everything down to how much it costs for the hairdresser. I think that this is important. It's just transparency to the consumer so that they're familiar with what it's going to cost. But getting back to that, how much is a funeral? It's individual. And it's hard to give a blanket statement as far as how much a funeral is going to cost. And again, no better reason than to why have that appointment to sit down and talk about pre-planning. The other thing I just kind of want to touch on as well is the fact of how options have changed over time. And, you know, when my dad was killed, cremation was not unheard of, but very unusual. When I started funeral directing 33 years ago, our cremation rate was about 5%. Last year we closed out at about 58%, and the projection is only going to continue. However, I'm always shocked to find of how many people come in and they don't realize that they can have a visitation. They can take the body to church. They can do these things prior to cremation. And those are all things that education is key, you know, with pre-planning. Our Catholic faith teaches us that the body, whether it's intact or it's cremated, is treated with reverence and dignity. And if you've ever been to a funeral that I have done, we handle an urn with cremated remains no different than we do a casket. We have a glass ossuary, many of you may have seen it, that the urn is placed into. Pallbearers process into it with church. The urn's put in the back of a funeral coach. Just because it's in a different form, it shouldn't be treated any differently. And having said that too, it's also important that the church dictates that cremated remains should be placed in a sacred place. And that can be a church cemetery, columbarium, and really should not be kept at home or scattered or separated. The guidelines for this belief are rooted in the belief that the resurrection of the body and the importance of preserving the integrity of that human body. So, in addition, pre-planning gives you the opportunity to plan not only your liturgy through selecting readings, music, and family participation, but it gives you the opportunity to dictate how you wish to be handled in the end. So I put together a folder. You're welcome to take it. The folder that I put together is literally the template that I sit down and complete with families. It's really very slightly modified from at need, the pre-need and the at need, but you will see, I think it's 6 pages long. If anything, take a look at it and then think about having to complete all of those 6 pages and coming up with all of that information after you've just had a significant loss in your family. The other thing I put in that folder is the liturgy prep. I love it when a family comes in and they picked up their readings, they picked out their hymns, they know who they want to sing, they know who they want to as an accompanist. Those are all the detail items that are also valuable to families. When I meet with particularly kids, well, I'm going to even go another farther because I can say it because I'm a guy, but nothing hurts my heart more is when I'm sitting at a table with men. They don't know their mother's maiden name. They don't know what kind of flowers they liked. The details are out the window. And it's just a way for you to be able to ensure that your wishes, and it's, in the end, it's a gift to those who are left behind. So I think I've probably gone over my time limit. So I think, are we going to open up for question and answer after?
We're going to let everybody speak, then we'll open for questions at the end.
Sounds great. Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If anyone should need to move around, feel free, but otherwise we'll let Eric Krobish come up and share from a legal perspective into life issues and bioethics. Eric is a partner at the law firm of Mueller, Lawson & Krobish. He attended college at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and law school at the John Marshall Law School in Chicago. He resides in Grundy County with his family and is a member of our Immaculate Conception Parish. He is a longtime member of the Knights of Columbus and the Lions Club. In his spare time, he's a beekeeper and enjoys fishing, hunting, camping, and working in his yard and his gardens. In addition to family law cases, he has also handled a variety of other matters, like probate, wills, and powers of attorney, guardianships, real estate, criminal and traffic law, and more. So thank you, Eric, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to some extent, repeat some of what Matt said. The planning aspect is a big part of what I'm going to be speaking to you about today. I get the task of trying to make sense to you in a short period of time, something that's about as clear as mud, honestly. But before I delve into those details, I was thinking as Matt was speaking a couple little stories that I think they're funny anyway. Both my in-laws have passed away within the past 7 or 8 years, so when my father-in-law died first, we went up to Minnesota, which is where my mother-in-law was from, for the funeral up there. So I've been to this church many, many times over the years. I've been going there for probably 30 years now. And we have the service in the church, and we go out to the cemetery behind the church. And somewhere along the way, they had a big board with a list of all the names in the cemetery plots and stuff. So I'm just standing there, killing time looking at this board, and I see my name on the board. Why is my name on this list of cemetery plots? So I of course asked my wife, what's going on? And she said, oh, Mom and Dad, they bought plots for the two of us and for my sister and her husband and the two of them. I go, okay, well, thanks for telling me that. So now when we go to visit the graves, I can stand on my own gravesite. My other story is actually true. I just saw this again recently, which made me think of it, but some of you may have seen it. It popped up online or social media or something recently, but apparently the oldest woman in the world was this lady in France, and she lived to be like 122 years old, I believe, is what I'd read. And born in, I don't know, whatever that would be, the late 1800s. So she'd seen a lot of change in her life, but in any event, when she was probably in her 90s, if I remember the story correctly, an attorney approached her about buying her apartment in Paris, and basically agreed to pay her, X dollars per month, or whatever the currency is, so much per month for the rest of her life. And he thought he was getting a great deal. So he paid and paid and paid, and she just kept living and living. And as it turned out, he actually died before she did. After paying more than the apartment was worth. So what I've been asked to talk to you about is powers of attorney, living wills, and wills. Just so I get a sense of who I'm talking to and what people know about this. How many people have powers of attorney? Okay, all right, pretty good number. How about wills? Okay. Okay, well, some of you may have heard this, it's gonna be new to some of you, but I'll start with powers of attorney. There's kind of a logical order in this. So powers of attorney take effect and are only effective during your lifetime. It's powers of attorney for property, powers of attorney for healthcare. It deals with how are your affairs going to be handled, how are your healthcare decisions going to be made when you're no longer able to make them for yourself, okay? I get a lot of people who come in to see me, unfortunately, asking to do a power of attorney after someone's already in a situation where they may not be competent. They generally the competency, or somebody may be in a hospital in a coma or something like that, and then people think about that because they realize they don't have anything. They don't have any power of attorney. They have no provisions, and all of a sudden now they need those things to help deal with whatever the issues may be. And if you think about it, there's a million of them. Your bank accounts, your taxes, your real estate, and the list goes on, and your healthcare decisions. So I have to tell them, well, if grandmother or mom or whoever is, if she's in, well into dementia at this point, for example, I can't help you with a power of attorney. You have to be competent to execute a power of attorney. So if you don't do that now at a time when you're competent and able to do so, then you're leaving yourself in a pretty bad situation, which I'll get to and explain further in a little bit. So the power of attorney will, the way I draft them anyway, they take effect immediately, and I'll explain why in a little bit. And then they terminate upon your death. That's by operational law. Or you can always terminate it at any point in time during your lifetime, as long as you're competent to do so. You can terminate it, revoke it, modify it, come up with a new one at any point. But they do terminate upon your death, and that's when a will kick in, okay? With the power of attorney, let me back up actually, and on the topic of executing those documents while you're still competent to do so. I actually had a case, probably 10 years ago now. I had a client who had represented for a while on various different things and was probably in his 30s at the time. And I had just seen him not too long before, but I got a call from his girlfriend or wife at the time, I don't remember. But in any event, I got a call from her, and they had been out to eat over at Hank's Farm over in Ottawa, and she said they had just gotten in the car and were a mile down the road, and he had a massive stroke in the car. So it was that same kind of story that or the same kind of situation I explained, which was she called me and she's like, well, he doesn't have a power of attorney. I need to take care of all this stuff. And I said, well, you kind of got a problem here. He was over at the hospital, I think, at St. Joe's. So I said, how, what is his condition? And physically, I think he had no movement on one side of his body. But she said he can interact, he can talk, and so on and so forth. So I said, all right, I'll come over to the hospital and I'll meet with him and I'll try to get some sense, because I knew him fairly well, get some sense whether, mentally, in terms of competency, he's able to execute. So I did. I went over, met with him, and I was satisfied that he was. I knew him well enough. He was having trouble talking, but he could engage with me to an extent that I could tell, mentally he was okay. So we went ahead and we executed powers of attorney with him that day. He could barely sign. He had to have help with his hands to do that. I know one of the nurses was watching and was very nervous about that, as she should have been. She was a little concerned, like, is that legal? And I said, well, not preferable, but I've known him for a long time. I know him well enough to be able to tell you that, yeah, he's competent, he's able to do this. That was, really lucky for him and for, his family at that point in time, because the alternative is court-ordered guardianship, which gets to be very expensive and can be very messy. So that's one of the only examples I've had of where somebody waited and didn't do that, and we were able to kind of salvage it at the last minute. So your power of attorney, in most cases I handle, I don't do a ton of these, but it's generally going to be, your agent's generally going to be a family member, a close friend, someone who knows your wishes, knows what you would want in terms of how to handle your affairs, your property, your advance directives, and those sort of decisions. It doesn't have to be. There is such a thing as corporate agents for power of attorney, and I dealt with that once or twice. Usually that's somebody who either doesn't have family or doesn't have anybody nearby, or occasionally I've seen a scenario where there is family and they don't want to be involved. In fact, I just dealt with one of those recently. So that it, once again, ends up being a situation in court. With your power of attorney, so you can designate any number of agents or successor agents. What I usually recommend with the cases I deal with is you appoint a primary agent, of course. And with the short form, the statutory short form, which is what I use, and I believe they printed out forms of that, you can't have co-agents. You can only have one agent at a time. There's what's called a durable power of attorney. I kind of think of it as a custom power of attorney, maybe a better way to put it. You can have co-agents with that. I don't think it's a good idea. And the example I always give people is if you name two co-agents and they don't agree on what to do, now you got a mess. Now what are you going to do? It's a stalemate, and unless somebody can come up, you can manage to come up with a decision, then to some extent it may be like you don't even have that document because everybody just sits there in the stalemate and nothing happens. So the statutory short form does not allow co-agents at all. So you have one agent, and then you can name as many successors as you want. I had people come in to see me that just want to name one agent, and that's good enough. And I said, okay, I'll do whatever you want, but I generally suggest you name at least one successor, if not two successor agents. When you talk about healthcare is a good example. If your agent thinks they can handle those decisions, and you get to that point where their actions are necessary, they realize they can't. Once again, if you don't have a successor name, you don't have anybody at that point, and your power of attorney is basically useless. So I always suggest at least one successor, if not two. You get into that issue too if you have agents who don't live close by, those kind of issues, or husbands and wives. Husbands usually list wives, and wives usually list husbands as their agent. And unfortunately, things happen. If you're out driving with your spouse, you get in an accident, and you're both incapacitated. Once again, if you don't have somebody else named, you don't have anything to work with. So those are the kind of things that you need to think about when you're making those decisions. The agents you designate in your power of attorney, the short form, and you'll see this if you have the form, will also allow you to designate them as your guardians if a guardian needs to be appointed by the court. So that's an indication of your intent and your designation that the court will give credence to and consideration if it comes to that for any reason. I mentioned previously the power of attorney will terminate automatically on death. I do a little bit of this work, as I said. I do a ton of family law work, parentage cases, adoptions, divorces, that kind of things. So just in case anybody's ever wondering, if you get divorced, the law treats your former spouse as having predeceased you, even if you never change your will or your power of attorney. So, not that may be a big concern here, but the law has taken that into account. So nobody's ex-spouse is suddenly acting as, or soon-to-be ex-spouse is acting as their agent in that scenario. So the alternative, and I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but the alternative to like I said, the power of attorney. If you don't have a power of attorney, valid power of attorney, with property, with your property and your assets and things like that, the only alternative that you really have is a court-ordered guardianship. With your health care, there's a statute in Illinois, it's called the Surrogacy Act, so it's kind of Byzantine, honestly. There's an order of priority and a whole bunch of conditions that would have to be met, but theoretically, even without a power of attorney, somebody could come in and act as your surrogate for healthcare decisions. But if nobody steps up voluntarily to do that, then once again, you're back in a situation where you're in court with a guardianship. Guardianship proceedings can go smoothly when they do. They're not terribly difficult, but it's time consuming. With power of attorney, you have that immediately. It's right there. There's really no delay at all. If you need to get a guardianship, that process, even when it runs smoothly, is probably going to take a minimum of 2 to 3 months. And cost-wise, there's no comparison. Our office, and I haven't looked at this in a while, but I think we charge $350 for a couple for a basic will and powers of attorney, living will, all of that. A guardianship, even a one that goes smoothly and is relatively simple, is going to cost thousands of dollars at a minimum. So a little bit of pre-planning in advance, back on that theme, will save a ton of money and a ton of time and heartache and hassle for your family or for whoever's going to be stuck having to go into court to get that guardianship. The other thing that the pre-planning with the power of attorney and so forth, the other thing that does is it avoids some potentially really ugly court battles and scenes in court. I had a case probably going on 15, 20 years ago now. It was an older couple, I believe. They were both no longer competent. I don't remember what the health issues were and so forth, but the daughter and her husband came into me wanting to establish a guardianship. They had no powers of attorney. It was too late to do that. So I filed the paperwork. We got into court. Well, you have to give notice to family members and so forth. And once we did that, the son kind of popped up out of nowhere and decided he wanted to be guardian and started making all kind of really ugly allegations against his mother and his father. And it just downward spiraled from there. That case, they probably spent $15,000, $20,000 fighting in court, and it was bad. Some of the worst cases I deal with are not so much the divorces, although those can certainly be bad. It's the family fights when people are fighting over wills or fighting over who's going to be the agent in a power of attorney. So trust me when I say you really want to avoid that. They're terrible situations. I'll touch briefly on living wills. What I talked about now up to this point is the powers of attorney. So powers of attorney, you're naming an agent to make decisions for you. Living will is just a single-page document. It's essentially an advance directive wish, so to speak. So I use it again the statutory short form. You can modify that to some extent, but with that living will, that's just you stating this is what my wishes are so far as advance directives. If it's properly witnessed by two people, that's just another tool in the arsenal, so to speak. If you have both a healthcare power of attorney and a living will, in Illinois, the power of attorney takes precedent. Okay, so you'll have your agent there to make that decision for you. As far as who you designate as your agent, and this, I guess this would be true to the extent that they're designated as a guardian too. If you need to go into court for a guardianship, the court will give priority to that and isn't going to ignore that or overturn those directions unless there's some really egregious action by an agent, stealing from you, making very poor decisions. I as an agent under a power of attorney or removed a guardian. So it's not common, at least in my experience. So far as wills, where your power of attorney leaves off upon your death, that's where your will picks up, okay? And I think most people have a general understanding of what that is. The will only becomes effective on your death. It's how you want your property, your assets, and so forth disposed of, who you want to be handling your estate as your administrator, your executor. You can designate in your will, if you have minor children, you can designate who you would want as guardian for your children while they're still minors. And again, the court will, absent, some really compelling reason, will generally follow that request in that direction. The nice thing about having the will, and I guess the best reason to have it, is because you control what happens with your own estate. If you don't have a will, the state of Illinois has provisions for what will happen to your estate, but that statute will be followed. Maybe that was your intention, maybe it wasn't. But there's a whole chart. I remember doing this in law school. So if you pass away with a spouse and children, that's where your estate goes first. If you don't have any descendants, then you go back up a step to your parents, and then down from them to your siblings, and then it goes further out to aunts and uncles and their siblings and their grandparents and their children, and it can lead to a lot of unintended results, I guess I'll put it that way. So it's a good idea to make those plans yourself instead of leaving it to chance. You cannot disinherit your spouse. That's the law, at least in Illinois. So you can create a will that would purport to leave everything to whoever you want, to your neighbor, to the mailman. But if you're married, your spouse is going to probably say, no, I want my portion of that, and the law provides for half of your estate to go to your spouse in that situation. You also can't disinherit minor children. So again, you can create a will that says anything you want, but if you have minor children, then your children are going to automatically get a portion of your estate as well. One thing that I do with the wills, and again, I just do simple wills. I don't get into tax planning or any of that kind of thing, but one thing I do with the wills, and this is something I borrowed from another attorney somewhere along the way, and then I've kind of customized it to my own use over time. But I have added a provision that's kind of, in my opinion, designed to prevent the ugly family battles in court and probate. And it just basically says, and I think it's in the form I brought, it says if anybody attempts to contest this will and they're unsuccessful, they get nothing out of my estate. If there's anybody who's a beneficiary or of this will and they contest, they get nothing. So it forces somebody who might want to roll the dice and engage in that kind of a fight in court. It forces them to gamble a little bit, because if they gamble and they're wrong, they get nothing. So it's designed to hopefully avoid that kind of battle in court and keep things running as smooth as possible. One other aspect of the will forms that I use, and I brought two. One's just a very simple, 3 or 4 page will. That's what I use for people where they don't have minor children. The other, if you looked at those, it was much longer, and I think starting on about page 2 or 3, there's several pages of really single space, pretty thorough paragraphs. That's a testamentary trust. That's basically, the intention of that is to make provisions for your children, and that's whether they're minors or not. I know when I did mine, the way I set my will up was, we provided, I don't remember the exact details of it, but we basically said, if our children went to college and graduated, then they would get their share of our estate, my wife and I, at age 25. If they didn't go to college, didn't graduate, then they had to wait till they were 30. And quite frankly, the idea behind that being, if they get to college, they graduate, and they've made it that far, I hope that they would be smart and make good decisions. But if they didn't, then, then I'm gonna make them wait a little bit longer to hopefully mature a little bit more and not, waste away whatever they get in the estate. So I've used that form for many years, and I customize for people based on what they want. Some people have no concerns at all. When my child turns 18, they can have full access to my estate. I'm not worried about it. Others will say 21. I've had people that go well beyond 30. That's your prerogative, I guess. But it's all, however you want to handle that, we can customize that sort of thing in any way. One aspect of your will is, again, who's going to administer your estate. So you can name your executor in your will, and that's just going to be the person who's going to deal with probate proceedings in court, who's good. They have to publish, and I don't want to get too far into this. It's another topic entirely. But when your person dies, you file a will with the clerk's office. You have to do that within 30 days by law. Then you would publish notice of the death in the paper. That's the purpose of that, is to give notice to creditors. So that's they're gathering your property, your assets. They're gathering your debts, and they're essentially doing all the legwork on that to make sure all your final expenses get paid, to make sure your wishes get carried out. Your property gets disposed of as you directed, and given to the people that you directed to go to. This is a little different than a power of attorney. There's no prohibition on how many executors you can have. You can name as many as you want. It's pretty common for people to name co-executors, at least in my experience. Just as with a power of attorney, you would not want to name a successor as well. Again, just to cover all your bases. Just like with a power of attorney, if it's spouses, generally they are naming each other as their executor, and then they may name children, adult children, or whoever it may be as successors. So it's a similar concept. It's just the document that takes precedence upon your death. I'm not going to get too deep into talking about trust. I don't do trust work other than the simple testamentary trust that I use in my form for children, for example. Trust is another way to make plans for your estate during your lifetime. And if you have a trust, one of the big benefits of trust, and why people like them and have them, is if you do it correctly, it could keep you out of probate entirely. So you don't have to go to court, you don't have to deal with probate. And it can also it'll maintain privacy as well. Probate proceedings are public proceedings, like most court proceedings are. So I have a lot of people who don't want the general public to know what's going on with their state and so forth. And I tell people, whether it's a divorce or a criminal case or probate or whatever it may be, there's almost never anybody in the courtroom when you're in court dealing with these things. Joe's there on a daily basis, so he can tell you that too. Nobody cares. It's very boring. Nobody wants to sit and listen to that unless it's something sensational. But if that's a concern, that's the nice thing about trust too, is it'll give you that privacy. There's still with a trust, you could put everything in trust during your lifetime, and anything that's in trust would pass outside of your probate estate. So that's why you can largely, if not completely, avoid probate. Chances are, at your passing, you're going to have something, some asset, some sort that may not fall within the trust for some reason. So if you have to go through a probate proceeding at that point, there are other alternatives to that. There's what they call a small estate affidavit. If your estate's, your total estate is, I think it's $100,000 right now. If it's $100,000 or less, and you meet various requirements, then there's literally just a form that your executor can sign, and that creditors and everybody else can rely on, so you don't have to actually go file a probate proceeding in court. I just saw recently they're trying to raise that limit to $500,000. There's legislation may be pending on that, and that's way overdue because it's been 100,000 for as long as I can remember. But that's a process as well. Anything that you have that passes by beneficiary designation, for example. So life insurance, if you have a beneficiary designation or a transfer on death account or a joint bank account, if you jointly own real estate, if you jointly own a vehicle with a spouse or something along those lines, all of those things will pass automatically, whether by those beneficiary designations or survivorship, and those sort of assets don't have to go through probate either. Again, if I mentioned before, if you don't have any will, then you're looking at the process of intestate, intestacy, and the state will determine where your estate's going to go. And there's similarly in that situation, there's a priority for who can administer your estate. If you haven't designated somebody, somebody's going to have to do that. And there's a list of priorities. It's not very long, actually. It could get to a point pretty quickly where if nobody's able or willing to step up and do that for you, the bottom of the list of priorities, theoretically, anybody could open an estate for you upon your death. And this does happen, actually, with some frequency. So when somebody passes, if nobody else opens a probate estate for them in court, it's not uncommon at all for a creditor or an attorney or somebody to go open an estate for them, because that's the only way you can collect your bill, your debts, or whatever you may owe. So if nobody else is willing or able to do it, literally anybody could file that probate estate. So again, if you want to avoid that sort of thing, then make your plans in advance. This is very cursory, basic. I could go for hours on this and all the details, and that's, nobody probably wants to hear that right now. That's maybe a little boring, but it gives you an idea of the stuff you have to think about. And I'm always not surprised, I guess, but the people that come in to see me, I start explaining, okay, what about this? What about this? What do you want to have happen here? And you just don't think about it. And I can't tell you maybe one or two times over many years where people came in, they thought about it, they had it all planned out, they knew what they wanted. More often than not, I'm just pointing out things that to me are pretty obvious, based upon what I do for a living, and people just have never given it any thought whatsoever. And more often than not, they have to leave, go home, think it over, and then come back, and then we go back through it again, and I get the details and create the documents for them. It is a very easy thing to procrastinate. Nobody likes to think about this. Nobody likes to think about their own mortality. I will freely admit, I had been an attorney for at least 5 years before I created a will for myself and my wife. So, attorneys are the same way. And I know there's lots of attorneys who don't even have wills or powers of attorney. That said, if you don't do it for yourself, what I would say then is at least do it for your family, do it for the people that are going to have to deal with these issues if you don't have a will, if you don't have a power of attorney, because it's a nightmare. It really is. If you don't have those documents, somebody's going to have to step up and do an awful lot of difficult work, and probably spend a decent amount of money too. Into thousands of dollars easily, especially with powers of attorney, to take care of all those things that you didn't make plans for yourself. And to kind of echo what Matt said, this doesn't matter whether you're in your 70s or your 50s or your 20s for that matter. None of us can predict what's going to happen, and bad things happen to people and at any age. So I always strongly encourage people to have those documents. The cost is minimal compared to the cost of not doing anything. And they can be modified. You can modify them as many times as you want. As your life changes, your family grows, and your kids are adults and so forth. You just modify the documents, but at least you have something in place. So I would definitely suggest that for everybody. And then if you want to get into, if you need to get into more tax planning and that sort of thing, then, that's a completely different topic as well, and that can get very complex, but, those services are certainly available to, with people that's more that specialize in estate planning. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Eric. I'll invite Cheyenne to join us now. Cheyenne Sheehan is the hospice liaison for OSF Hospice in the I-80 region. This region serves surrounding hospitals, continuous care facilities, and local communities. Cheyenne has a degree in wellness administration. In her hospice liaison role, she appreciates the opportunity to discuss comfort-focused care. She lives in Ottawa and enjoys attending her nephew's events and thrifting. Thank you, Cheyenne.
Thank you. Well, thanks. I don't have lots of things prepared like the previous guys before me. A lot of times I just get to have a conversation. So with talking about hospice, no one wants to talk about it, right? We don't want to think about, shoot, we're talking about dying. So who has ever heard of hospice before? Maybe you've experienced hospice with your families.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful in a way that you know how great hospice can be. Not wonderful, right, that you lost a loved one, because that's never easy. Grief is difficult. Going through all of those feelings and emotions, it's a lot to deal with. So having hospice on board a lot of times helps make that process just, I'd say, that much easier maybe. So when we're talking about hospice, we're talking about comfort-focused care. We're talking about kind of switching our viewpoint from being always fixing the problem, fixing whatever is going on, to transitioning to just being a little bit more comfortable. And when we say comfortable, we mean anything under the sun that brings you a little bit of peace, okay? So while I'm talking, I am just talking about OSF hospice, okay? Just because that is what I can speak to. But there are several other hospice agencies, and a lot of things go with different agencies, whether we're talking about here in Illinois, or we're talking about Michigan, or Florida, or wherever else, okay? Hospice is available wherever. Comfort-focused care is available wherever you need it to be. So when we talk about hospice, oftentimes we're talking about it a couple days before your loved one is passing away, or before, when things are not well. Like we talked about already, these things sometimes come up when we least expect it. Now, it's always good to have hospice on board, or just to know that this service is available ahead of time. So you can have a diagnosis, anyone can have a diagnosis 6 months or less, and I'm using this in quotes, to still be around if you let your diseases progress naturally. Oftentimes, hospice can be on board for longer than that, way longer than that. Hospice does not mean that we're necessarily dying tomorrow, okay? That's one of the biggest things that I get to talk to families about is, we know that someone can take us at any point in time, right? We know that anything can happen in a blink of an eye. But at the same time, let's be prepared. Let's just have this conversation. That way, when we need it, we know it's available. And when we're ready to kind of switch from always fixing that problem, always having, whether it's chemotherapy for your end-stage cancer, whether it is continued dialysis for your renal disease, whether it is just kind of Alzheimer's dementia. It seems like dementia is on the rise. It's continued to grow, and lots of times it goes undiagnosed for a long time. So whatever those diseases could be that you or your loved one are living with, and we're ready to have a little bit more assistance, that's when hospice can be on board as well, okay? So while we're talking about hospice and treatment and switching our gears from always fixing it, We're also not going to be too worried about going to the doctor. I mean, who likes going to the doctor? Most times. I more so like the chit chat with my nurse practitioner because, we're catching up on this, that, or the other. But then she says, oh, we'll go get some blood work, maybe we'll have this MRI, maybe we'll do this, maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll lose 25 pounds, all of these things that she wants you to do. And it's like, I don't know if I want to do all that just yet. Let's pump the brakes. So when we're transitioning over to hospice, we don't have to worry about going back and forth to the doctor anymore. That's no longer a priority, okay? We want you to have quality time at home with your loved ones or wherever you're at that point in time, okay? Because hospice is not just at home. Oftentimes it is at home. We bring a whole team of people into your home. You welcome us in and we become part of the family, hopefully. Okay, so you would have a nurse visiting routinely, at least once a week by Medicare guidelines. You would also have a CNA, who is like a certified nursing assistant, a bath aide, to help with more personal cares. You would also have a hospice social worker, who helps oftentimes with powers of attorney and funeral arrangements. And we also have a hospice chaplain, who is more, he can talk spiritual, of course, but he does not have to. It could be more holistic as well. We also have a bereavement coordinator, a part of our team. And this bereavement coordinator, because we know grief comes in all shapes and sizes, and it sometimes starts when you're diagnosed with this end stage condition or when things are changing and we really don't know how to deal with it. So that's why we have a bereavement coordinator that follows us along for 13 months after your loved one would pass away. So this whole team of people that I just talked about can come into your home and visit with you guys rather than having to go out and to have these things done at other locations. It's provided in the comfort of your own home. Oftentimes we also do it, we perform hospice, whether it's at an assisted living facility, because we know at one point in time, maybe we don't want to be at home anymore. Maybe we want to go to the assisted living facility that has activities and meals and all these other things, or we want to travel and do other things, and this is better than being in our house, right? So the assisted living facility is where we could perform hospice, as well as a nursing home, or even a hospital, because sometimes our symptoms cannot be managed at home and we need to go to a hospital, okay? So there's lots of different ways that we can bring hospice on board, but it's always good to have the idea of hospice is scary, but we try and make it to where it's not so scary, to where we're walking with you every step of the way, because that nurse is available 24/7 for you to call and say, hey, this is what's going on with my husband, and I don't know what to do next. What do I do? Do I give medications? Do I take him to the hospital? What's going on? And that nurse that's always available is going to say, okay, did we try giving this one medication? Or do we try repositioning? Or do we try X, Y, and Z? And that nurse may even come out to your house at 2 o'clock in the morning to help you with whatever is going on, because you need that extra hand. And we don't want to have to go to the hospital and spend 14 hours in the ER or however long it could be at that point in time. Okay. So that's a little bit just about our team that I've talked about coming home, coming to your house and being a good support within your house. Some people think, right, and I get to talk about hospice every single day to community members. So my role is just to where I get to come and have this conversation, and it's an open conversation. Just like when we're talking about planning our funeral or getting a power of attorney, it's an open conversation to get some information and also to be a little bit more prepared. So when we're also talking about kind of how things are changing with our bodies, it's scary. I know some of you are like, hospice, I don't know. Right? Because it is, right? So, let's see. I had like a plan in my head, and I want to make sure I'm getting some of the things off of there. Medication wise, people are like, if we're going on hospice, you're telling me I can't go to the doctor, I can't go to the hospital, I can't have blood work. What about my medicines? What are you going to do with my medicines? Are those all going to be gone? Not necessarily. Some of them, yes. Some of them we might recommend to stop. Just because, what's the point of taking fish oil still? If we're talking about end of life care, we're talking about, yes, dying, why are we still worried about taking a fish oil? I started taking fish oil one day and I read on TikTok, I seen it and I said, yep, fish oil, right? Right, TikTok, fish oil, whatever. So I started taking it. I don't know why some people take it for 25 years. It's probably really good for you, but we'll see. So something like that, something like, I don't take it, she says. So something like fish oil, we might recommend to stop, or some other, chemotherapy pill, or if it is sometimes insulin. We talk about stopping insulin, just because at one point in time, some of these medications are not worth taking. Your quality of your life and being able to digest that medication and have that in your body is not as much needed as it was maybe 10 days before, or 2 weeks before, or 2 months before, whatever it be. Okay, so that's one of the big things that I always get asked is, what about my medicines? The next big one is talking about how much does this cost me? It's always okay, you're selling me this service, hospice is a service that I'm electing, how much is it going to cost? Well, hospice is completely covered by Medicare. So as long as you have Medicare, it's covered at 100%. If you have VA insurance, if you have Medicaid, if you have personal, like generic health insurance or your supplemental insurance, those all help cover hospice as well, okay? So anything that is related to the hospice diagnosis, which is usually your terminal diagnosis, so when we're talking about cancer or Alzheimer's disease, or if we're talking about liver failure, if we're talking about a stroke, anything like that is all going to be covered under your hospice diagnosis. Medicare pays for everything. That's talking about our team coming in, our medications, our supplies, and our equipment. So another benefit of having hospice is we get to bring a lot of things into your home or into whatever community you're at that point in time, whether it's the nursing home or someone else's home, your child's home, or the hospital. Typically, we're bringing in a hospital bed, we're bringing in oxygen, maybe a bedside commode, maybe we're talking about briefs and wipes and gloves and bandages for wounds. We bring in all of these things that are also covered by Medicare. So the only thing that you guys are having to pick up when you have a hospice elected is sometimes room and board at a nursing home. And that's the only thing you have to pay. No longer these extra medicines, especially when we're not taking fish oil, then we don't have to pay for it anymore, right? So Medicare pays for a lot of these things. And if it's something like your fish oil or like another medication you want to continue taking and it's not related to your end stage diagnosis, that's just going to go to your supplemental insurance, or you'll pay for it out of pocket like you have been before electing hospice. Okay. So those are usually my two biggest questions, is medicines and how is this covered. Another big one is, when does hospice stop? Well, of course, hospice stops when your loved one passes away. But hospice can also stop a little bit sooner than that, because sometimes you graduate off hospice, right? Mike, we talked about that earlier. Sometimes you do. You graduate off hospice because you're doing just a little too good to be on our services. So we look at that every 60 to 90 days. Usually it's 90 for the first period and then 60 days after that. We look at everything and we look at the big picture. How much have you changed? How much has your body naturally progressed over the last 60 days? Does it make sense still for our team, for the hospice team, to me coming in and out of your house or in and out of your nursing home or just visiting with you? Does it make sense? Does it make sense for you? Does it make sense for us? 9 times out of 10, we're able to keep coming out. But there's that one chance that I would say not often, but it's happened several times. So I've been a part of our hospice team for just over a year and a half. And several times we have had families that no longer fit hospice criteria because they're still out driving, they're still out, hanging out with their grandkids, they're still doing all of their own things, their own activities of daily living, their own ADLs. They're able to bathe themselves and all of those things. So we don't really need hospice. That's when we elect a different service, possibly a home health or outpatient palliative care. But hospice can be on board for as long as we need it, as long as there's still a reason for our team coming in. There's also the option too of stopping hospice because, like we talked about, that changing your mind of always fixing the issue at hand, always going back for chemotherapy and doing it time and time again. Sometimes we just need that little bit of a break and we're ready to be done, but then the other times, no. I want to go back. I want to try chemo one more time. Or I want to see what else is out there. I want to try a clinical trial or whatever it be. There's always the opportunity to stop hospice services and go back to doing what you were before. Of course, it'll always be a conversation. I say everything in hospice is a conversation because as we all know in this room, one doctor visit is not always the same as the other doctor visit, right? So we can always talk about stopping hospice services as well if needed. Because at the end of the day, you guys are making your own decisions, or we have our power of attorney that's going to make them for us, and you've already had those conversations. So we want to acknowledge those things as well as if you don't want to do hospice anymore and be on those services, you don't have to be. Okay? So that's always another big question that we talk through for hospice services. Okay. Those are the bigger things that I wanted to touch on, I think. I didn't use up my whole 15 minutes, I'm sorry.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started with the questions. So if you still have any additional questions that come up, feel free to write them down and give them to me and I'll pass them forward. But it looks like most of the questions are for Eric, so I'll let him start first.
I think that means I didn't do a very good job. Okay, so some of these are, are a little repetitive, so we'll cover, more than one at the same time, but these are good questions, actually. So when you select a power of attorney, does that mean the person makes all your decisions from that moment, or only if I can't make them for myself? I said we make our power of attorney effective upon execution. The reason we do that is you can specify power of attorney becomes effective upon XYZ, whatever situation, whatever circumstance that you want. The reason I make it effective upon execution is unless you foresee all the possible scenarios that occur, then, once again, you're bound by what's said in that document. So if you, say, I name power of attorney in the event that I am in a coma. Okay, well, there's lots of things that could happen. You may not be in a coma, but you still need somebody making your decisions. So that's why I make it effective immediately. What I tell people, kind of jokingly when they come in and sign this, is, very often spouses, say, understanding means it's effective now. So, don't make them mad. they could try to run with that power of attorney, but the true answer to that is if somebody's trying to act as your agent and you're perfectly healthy and competent and able to take care of yourself and you don't like it, then you just go tear it up or terminate the agency and problem solved, right? So, but that's the reason we do it that way, so that it gives you the most flexibility. What tips do you have for picking a good agent or executor? What should we consider when picking one? I guess I'll tell you from my experience when my wife and I did ours. So we we have different agents for our healthcare than we do for our property. And not surprisingly, the thing we looked at when we decided who we want as our agent for property is, you know, who's got good financial sense, who can handle these kind of things, you know, and has maybe some experience with that sort of thing. So that's how we viewed that. With the healthcare power of attorney, you know, for my wife and I, our biggest decision was, you know, we have our advance directives as part of our power of attorney. Who can make that tough call when it needs to be made? You know, so we immediately ruled out some people that we knew weren't probably going to be in a good state of mind when that came about, and so that's how we made that decision. So it's really just, you know the people you're considering, know your strengths and weaknesses, and you know whether they're going to be able to make that sort of decision. Is my suggestion as to how to approach that. Do power of attorney documents need to be notarized? So only your property power of attorney. The healthcare power of attorney, they both need to be witnessed. There's requirements for witnessing, but only the property power of attorney needs to be notarized. That one actually has a notary and 2 witnesses. I think the healthcare power of attorney just has the 2 witnesses in. Do you need to provide a power of attorney copy to doctor, hospital, anybody else? This is similar to the next question, which was living will or any of these documents for that matter, who should have copies. And Matt touched on this a little bit when he spoke. What I suggest to people is whoever you name is, for example, your agents with your power of attorney, whether it's a primary agent or successor, I would give each one of those people a copy, whoever you name as executor in your will, or if you have a designated guardian for your children in the will. Anybody basically who's going to be in a position of acting as an agent or acting as an executor or guardian or whatever it may be, give them copies of those documents. And then, you know, we'll give the originals to the people when they sign them, and I always say exactly what Matt says. You know, if you're going to put this in your lockbox, make sure somebody else has access to your lockbox, because it's like an act of Congress to get into a lockbox after, if you're not on the list, if it's, you know, just you and your spouse that have the key to the lockbox and they're signed onto it and something happens to both of you, it's going to be a nightmare getting into that thing. So, you know, probably a good idea to maybe whoever you name as your primary agent, for example, maybe if you're going to keep this in a lockbox, have them sign on to access that. If you keep it in a safe at home, make sure somebody else knows the combination to the safe or knows where to find it, so they can get access to those. I suppose you could give that to your doctor if your doctor wanted it. More than likely, I'm sure they probably don't. They're probably maybe they keep it in your file, you know, in your doctor's office. I've never experienced that myself, but more than likely, you probably don't need to do that. Just make sure that the agents and the executors in the will and so forth, make sure those people have them, and then they will take it from there. When that's needed, they'll get those documents, they'll provide them to the doctors, to the hospital, you know, to the bank, to whoever needs to have that in order for them to make the decisions for you. Okay, we kind of covered that one. If a person moves to a different state, do they need to write a new power of attorney, living will, DNR for that state, since there might be different requirements? So I can't tell you that I've ever, you know, looked at Wisconsin's Power of Attorney Act or their statute or any other state specifically. I'm only licensed here, so I've never had a need to do that. But I think, generally speaking, and from what little I've read, I think most states are pretty consistent with this. When I have people come in to do these, I always suggest, especially with the healthcare, I suggest do the power of attorney and do the living will, just in case you're traveling, you're in a state for some reason, maybe they accept powers of attorney and not living wills, or vice versa. That way you kind of got all your bases covered. So I do suggest people do both of those for that reason. But I think, you know, especially within the U.S., I think for the most part, one of the two is I think those kind of statutes are pretty uniform across the country now. So if you have a power of attorney that's valid in Illinois, then it's probably going to be valid just about anywhere in the country too. Worst case scenario, you know, if you do say, move to a different state, take your documents, contact a local attorney and just sit down and say, I want to make sure that this meets all the requirements in this state. It would probably take them 5 minutes, and they can look at it and tell you yes or no. Let's see, does agent and power of attorney have priority over medical people? So I'm glad this was asked, because I meant to touch on this also during hospice. So the advanced directive is part of your healthcare power of attorney. The statutory short form that I use and the form that I brought in has 3 basic options, and the way I kind of summarize them is, one is I want my agent to make the decision for me, as to whether or not to remove life support or whatever advanced directives, whatever that issue might be. I want my agent to make the decision. The middle one is, I want my agent to make the decision after consultation with my doctor, which you would think would happen anyway with the first option, right? And then the last one is my kind of summary of that is keep me alive at all costs. Okay, so those are the basic forms, generally speaking. Again, if you're talking family, relatives, people like that are going to be your agent. I think I can't imagine a scenario where somebody would be trying to make those decisions without talking to the doctor, for example, if you've been in a bad accident or you're on life support in the hospital. So, but your agent has the ultimate authority to make that decision, unless you happen to have a power of attorney that specifies otherwise. If you leave that to the doctor, for example. Can a lawyer in the family function for you if you wish? I assume that means can a lawyer function as an agent for you? Yeah, you can have anybody you want as your agent. There's rules about laws about executing the power of attorney. So, and I just look it up when I need to look it up. I don't try to memorize this, but you can't have one of your agents witness your power of attorney when you execute it. It has to be somebody else. Just like you can't have a beneficiary under your will be the witness to your execution of your will. So that general concept applies, but yeah, you could, and I guess to expand on that further, I should say, what we typically do in my office when we draft these documents, I'll tell people, if you want to bring in people to witness your will or your power of attorney, that's fine, but subject to these rules, you can't have anybody basically that's named in these documents that's going to act for you witnessing these documents for you. So what we almost always do, I can't think of a time I haven't done this, is I will generally either witness or notarize, depending on who's available when we do the signing, and then we'll have some of our staff come in, whether it's one of the assistants or somebody else, whoever is available will grab them and come in and witness. That way all your witnesses were right there in our office. If there's ever any question about competency or the legitimacy of the document or whatever, you know where to go. You come back to my office and those people, if they're not there, we'll at least know where to find them if they've left or moved on to a different employment or something. How much does a good will cost? Price range, living will, advanced directives. So like I said, with the living will, the power of attorneys, we just use the statutory short form. It's for the most part fill in the blank. There's some things you can customize. You can customize, especially with medical. You can customize, what types of treatments you definitely want, what types of treatments you definitely don't want. You can customize with a property power of attorney all the different things that you want, your agent to be able to cover, or things that you don't want them to be able to address. But those documents, the ones we use for the most part, are just forms, statutory forms. So, like I said, we haven't changed this price in years. For a couple, husband and wife, we do charge $350 for all those documents: living will, power of attorney, healthcare, property, will, everything. Which, for us, frankly, it's almost like a loss leader for us. For the amount of time we put into those documents versus what we charge for them, it's not even close. We definitely do a lot more work on them than what we charge for. But that's fine. That's not a big deal. As far as, you could have, I suppose, a very detailed will, and that's just probably, if it's something more than a relatively standard basic will, then it's just gonna be a function of hourly charges probably for your attorney. That's probably more applicable to like a trust. If you have a trust can get super complex. My father-in-law had a trust, and and I don't do a lot of this kind of work, but, I know, I'm trained, I know how to read the documents, I know what I'm looking at, and it made my head swim reading his trust. It was so complex. So, that kind of stuff, and if you're doing tax planning especially, those get really complex. You can get into a lot of money there. Estate planning could cost you thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, but when you're talking about, estates that could be worth millions of dollars, if you're talking about farmland and things like that, there's money well spent. So there's a gradient there, from, what do you need if you need a simple will versus all the way up to, do you need a fairly complex trust for tax reasons, then, you can go from a few $100s to thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Any other questions?
Just one comment. The power of attorney for healthcare is a good idea to have that with you if you take somebody to the hospital and you're the agent.
Yeah.
They're gonna want it.
Yep, they're gonna want it, right? It's a kind of a function, I think, of living in a small community. I think we're still a small enough community that I have people come in, fairly frequently, and they'll tell me, I've been making decisions. The doctors are talking to me. They're letting me make decisions. It happens a lot with like guardianships with minor children too. There's almost an epidemic of grandparents raising grandchildren. I've dealt with that a lot of times over the years, and I'll have people that'll come in and say, I've been raising these kids for 5 years, and the doctors don't question me, the school doesn't question me, they let me register the kids. I think that's a function of living in a small community, because if you were in Naperville trying to do that, or in Chicago, that's not going to happen. If you think there's a need for that document, you definitely have that person bring it with them, because the doctor should be asking for it. They should want to see it. And certainly if you're dealing with property and banks and the county, taxes, you name it, those people are definitely going to want to see a power of attorney. That's why that's a little more complex in terms of notarization and witnessing, because they will definitely make you share that document and make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted before they let you make any decisions when it comes to property.
If you were the power of attorney for property, you assume their bills and responsibilities?
No, so that's a good question. So with any power of attorney, and I guess this is probably more so for property, but it could apply to healthcare too. When you're acting as an agent for someone, you are not assuming any personal financial responsibility for them. So that person's estate, their property, is what pays for the bills and so forth. I had one of these come up fairly recently too, right here in town, and I think the practicality was it was her children that were her agent or successor agent. I think they paid for some things out of pocket because it was a guardianship. They didn't have the power of attorney set up, and I think she had Alzheimer's. They needed to be able to deal with stuff right away. It was kind of a bad situation. So, I think they were expending money out of pocket, but then ultimately they were able to be reimbursed out of her assets. Once we got the power, or the guardianship rather, set up, and they got letters of office and court authority, they were able to sell. She had real estate, they were able to sell that. They were able to, there was a trust account that her boyfriend set up for her in a bank. He had passed away months before, and that was her caretaker, so that's why the kids kind of got thrust into that role. They were able to get access to the trust account and were able to then reimburse themselves for all the money they'd expended out of pocket in the meantime while we were going through the process of getting the guardianship. So yeah, you're not personally responsible for the debts, the expenses of the person that you're an agent for, and you're entitled to be reimbursed for that. You could even be paid to act as an agent. So I mentioned corporate agents. Corporate agents definitely get paid. They don't do that out of the goodness of their heart. They're charging you for that service. In the statutory form, there's a provision talks about compensation of your agent. What almost always happens in the ones I deal with, again, family, spouses, things like that, people just generally cross that one off, because that's literally talking about getting paid a salary, if you want to think of it that way, to act as an agent, versus, just being entitled to reimbursement. You're always entitled to reimbursement for anything you expend on behalf of that person, but being paid, technically, you could set it up so that your agent gets paid for their services, essentially. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, if you're going internationally, study or work for a short period of time, would they honor if you carry POA or living will, or do you have any idea?
Yeah, I would.
We haven't found out from the corporation.
Yeah, that's a good question. It probably honestly depends on where you're going. I have no experience with that. I couldn't tell you. My guess would be nowadays, I would think that most places would probably honor that in some fashion. But you get places that if you're going to Afghanistan or a war zone or something like that, that's a different story. So short of trying to determine the laws of wherever you're going and to create something just for what may be a 10-day vacation, I don't know what you would do in that scenario. Maybe if you take your documents with you, if you're concerned about it, have them available, and if it works there, it works. But unless you're going to travel somewhere for a very long, if you're going to move to another country, obviously you want to contact legal counsel there and make sure that you have your ducks in a row. But as far as how an Illinois power of attorney would apply in some other country, that's going to vary depending on where you're at, I'm sure.
I think you'd be better to take a good credit card with you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's just so many variables there. That's way beyond my pay grade, I'll tell you. Any other questions for me? Thank you.
So I will just piggyback off of the power of attorney and hospice kind of question. So with hospice, sometimes we're dealing with a situation where your loved one who is going into hospice is making that decision, or whether you guys are making that decision for yourself, right? You're deciding that this is what you want to do. But a lot of times, our loved one is not able to make that decision at that point in time. So whether that is because Alzheimer's, dementia, or because they had a stroke, or any situation to where that your loved one is deemed incompetent and cannot make their own decisions, that's when the healthcare power of attorney comes into play, and we then have the healthcare power of attorney sign all of that paperwork, and then we're contacting the primary agent for all of our questions, concerns, or just updates, just letting you know what we're seeing, especially if you're not there for our visits. So I hope that answers the hospice part of the power of attorney question. So the first question on one of my cards is palliative care. So what is palliative care? I touched on it just briefly when I said either home health or palliative care. So palliative care is a comfort-focused care as well, but it's not as involved as hospice is. So with palliative care, you can still go to the doctor, you can still have blood work, receive chemotherapy treatments or dialysis or anything like that. As long as it's a curative treatment, you can still do those things on palliative care. But you also have a team, typically it's a nurse practitioner and a social worker that are available to you on palliative care or whoever the patient is, as an extra layer of support that may come out once a month or every 3 weeks or whatever the duration is set to be, and they would come out and make sure that you're doing good at home, especially if going out of the house is very difficult, because for some of our family members, that's a hard thing, whether it's mobility issues or if it's anxiety-driven issues of getting out of the house. That's when palliative care can come into play. You can have hospice and palliative care at the same time. A lot of times our palliative care team, at least with OSF, they might sign off and say, no, the medical director with you guys has it covered. I really don't need to keep coming out. Some they might stay on board just because that nurse practitioner might have been seeing you guys for 2 years and they want to just keep in touch with how things are going. You can also receive palliative care and home health at the same time as well to get that physical therapy or occupational therapy or wound care at home and still have a nurse practitioner who can prescribe medications and other treatment options as well coming to the house, okay? Palliative care, I can't talk too much more about it, but just because I don't know all about it. I don't get to work with palliative care every day. Because typically once we're electing hospice, we say, this is comfort focused enough, okay? So the next question is, could you please address pain management in hospice and how it is balanced with being able to be alert and participating in activities? So one thing about hospice is you're not homebound. Like with home health, you have to have a homebound status and you're not supposed to go to the grandkids' basketball games, or I think you're technically allowed to go to the grocery store, get your hair cut, certain things like that, but oftentimes you're homebound. With hospice, you don't have to have a homebound status to be on our services. You can still, like I said, some people are on hospice and they're still driving, and that's great. You can still do all of those things, so any activities that you do, whether that is driving, going to the grandkids' games, whether it is just visiting at home with family, or if we're at the nursing home and we want to participate in bingo, that's every Friday and every Tuesday, and we got to go to bingo because there's some good prizes on my bingo card. Whatever that is, right? You guys, whoever is the patient, they can still do all of those things. With hospice, because we're coming out so frequently, whether that's the nurse, the CNA, the chaplain, the social worker, whether any of our team is coming out and visiting, we're noticing some of these changes, and we're able to say, oh, I think this is too much. Let's back off on maybe some of these medications so that way we can be able to go out and to do these certain things, whether that is, like I said, going to the grocery store or what have you, or if it's not enough, if you say that, yeah, my pain is still an 8 out of 10 with my bone cancer, it's still an 8 out of 10, what else can we do to help out? So we look to the whole family, whether that's just a spouse, whether it's a child or whatever it be, but it's always a conversation of how can we better manage these symptoms to be able to still have the best quality of life that we can still have. And it's always an ongoing thing. It never stops until you pass away. And then, but in the meantime, there's always adjustments that can be made every single day. That's why hospice is available 24/7. Because you can call and say, this isn't working anymore. Okay, let's change it up. Let's get you something right now to help. So this next question is, what tips do you have for picking a good hospice? Are there any red flags? So like I told you guys, I'm talking from an OSF hospice perspective. There are several other agencies that are supported by Medicare. A lot is VITAS in this area and Lightways. There's also IHCC, that's out of Princeton. There is Compassus. There are so many other agencies that are not even in Illinois, that are in Florida, Michigan, whatever it be, okay? I can't tell you what those other agencies do, other than they go under Medicare guidelines, so they're supposed to have a whole interdisciplinary team to provide comfort-focused care. But what I can tell you is, picking a hospice agency is like, do you shop normally at Walmart? Or are you on Target? Or do you shop at the Jewels? Or the Hy-Vee? And yes, there's an S on the Jewels. So you decide what best fits you and your family and your needs at that point in time. Every agency should be able to give you information and let you know, this is our services, this is our team, this is our typical way that we go about certain things. And if that fits in line with what you need at that point, great. Then maybe that's the one for you. But I always tell families, hospice is not set in stone, because we can always change our mind as well. So say you're not satisfied with that agency. Sometimes it happens, or you don't jive with the nurse that's coming out most often. God love nurses. They are terrific, right? But sometimes we know that we're not on the same page as our nurse that's coming in. So if we need to swap out a nurse, we can do that. Any hospice agency shouldn't have an issue with changing a nurse, changing a CNA to get you someone different a part of their team. But say you just don't like OSF Hospice anymore, for example, and you want to go to another agency that's a little bit closer to home, whether home is just geographically or spiritually or any which way, right? You have that option to change a hospice agency as well, okay? Are there any other questions about hospice or comfort-focused care? Okay, and Matt was still good, he didn't have any questions. I turned it off, so you'll just have to turn it back on.
Okay, does anyone else have any lingering questions that they wanted to ask? Or do you have any lingering things that you wanted to say that you haven't had a chance to mention yet?
I think so.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. You're welcome to ask you. Oh, I also, thank you, Mary, for reminding me, I want to mention, Gabe so kindly videoed this for us. We had a couple people say I can't be there, but I'd really like to hear the topic. So he volunteered to do it for us, and we're planning to have it posted on our parish website. I'm not sure exactly when, but hopefully in the next week or two. Is that reasonable? Okay. In the next week or two, we'll work on the logistics. So if you know someone who wanted to come and couldn't, or you missed something, you wanted to hear it again, look for it on the Immaculate Conception Parish website.